Hey mga kawawmat, in this video we will discuss proving theorems on isosceles triangle. Our objectives: we will prove congruence properties in an isosceles triangle. We will use conditions of a triangle congruence to prove congruent segments and angles. So ano ba yung mga conditions na yon? We have the triangle congruence and postulates and theorems, yung SAS, SSS, the HL, HA. So yun po yung mga yon. And then we will prove theorems on isosceles triangle using the conditions and the properties. So let's start. So let's have first the parts of isosceles triangle. So from the given triangle, we have the vertex angle. So ito po yung tinatawag nating vertex angle. Ito yung peak. Okay? Siya yung tuktok. Okay? Tuktok siya nung dalawang sides na congruent natin. So, ano ba yung parts ng ating isosceles? We also have the legs of the isosceles triangle. So, ito po yung legs ng ating isosceles. So, as you can see, they are congruent. So, the two sides of the isosceles triangle are congruent. And then, we also have the base. So, itong side na kung saan hindi equal sa dalawang ito ay ang tinatawag nating base. Okay? So, kung itong dalawang sides na to ang equal, ito po ang base natin. Kung itong dalawang sides na to ang equal, ito naman ang base natin dyan. Okay? So, kung ano yung hindi equal na side, unequal dun sa dalawa, that is your base. And then we also have your base angle. So, ito pong base angle, tatawagin natin silang base angle kapag yung angle niya is doon mo nakuha sa kanyang base. So, ito, kung ano yung angle na nasa peak o nasa included angle ng dalawang sides mo na congruent, that is your vertex angle. So, let's have the properties of isosceles triangle. So, I have here an isosceles triangle. So, always remember the two sides of isosceles triangle are congruent to each other. Okay? So, congruent po yung two sides ng isosceles triangle po natin. Okay? Now, in some definitions, we can also say that isosceles triangle has at least two sides that are congruent. So, at least two sides. So, ibig sabihin, it can be three sides that are congruent. So, dito papasok yung equilateral triangle. That's why equilateral triangle is a special case of isosceles triangle. So, we have here, again, the two sides or the legs of your isosceles triangle are congruent. So, we have the OB, segment OB or side OB is congruent to OX. So, yun po yung kanyang congruent sides. And then the third side, which is unequal to the other two sides. So, since ito yung dalawa ay equal, yung unequal dito sa dalawang side na to is what we call the base. So, ito po yung tinatawag nating base. Next, so we have our base, segment BX. The two angles opposite to the equal sides are congruent to each other. So, that means that it has two congruent base angles. So, tatandaan na kapag yung two sides ng triangle natin ay congruent, ibig sabihin yung angle na opposite ng mga sides na yon, ng congruent sides na yon, are also congruent. So, since congruent itong dalawang sides mo, yung opposite angle niya at opposite angle nito congruent din. Okay? So, yung congruent po yung ating mga base angles. So, anong mga angles ang congruent dito? We have angle B is congruent to angle X. So, therefore, yung base angles natin sa isosceles triangle ay congruent. So, we have angle B is congruent to angle X. And then the angle which is not congruent to the congruent base angles is called the vertex angle. So, ito po yung ating vertex angle. So, again, we have two sides of the triangle that are congruent. The unequal side is your base. Tatandaan na kung ano po yung opposite angle ng dalawang congruent sides. Since congruent sila, congruent din po yung angles na opposite sa kanila. Okay? And then yung angle na hindi congruent, that is what we call the vertex angle. So, that is angle O. So, let's have the isosceles triangle theorem. Let's have first Theorem 6 dash 1. So if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite those sides are congruent. So let us prove the given theorem. So i-prove natin na kapag yung two sides daw po ng triangle ay congruent, then the angles opposite those sides are congruent. So let us prove this theorem. So ito yung given natin, na yung two sides daw ay congruent. So kapag congruent daw itong two sides, congruent din daw yung opposite angle. So our given is, yung two sides na congruent, we have AB is congruent to CB. So we will prove na yung angles opposite niya, etong angle A and angle C are also congruent. So yun ang ipoprove natin. So let's have the two-column proof. So our statement, we have first triangle ABC with segment AB is congruent to segment CB. So we have, this is given. And then from our given, we have, let us draw a line from B to the midpoint of segment AC, which is R. So mag-draw tayo ng line from B to the midpoint. So pag sinabing midpoint, pinakagitna. To the midpoint of segment AC, so ang i-name natin siya as point R. So anong reason dito? 2 points determine a line. Okay, so meron tayong point doon, meron tayong midpoint dito, so 2 points determine a line. So nag-form tayo ng ating line, okay, doon sa ating vertex point, doon sa ating vertex angle, at dito sa ating midpoint ng segment AC. Now from here, since midpoint po ito, pag sinabi kasi nating midpoint, ibig sabihin pinakagitna siya, di po ba? So, ibig sabihin, etong segment na to ay congruent po dito. So, AR is congruent to CR kasi midpoint meron siyang binanggit na midpoint. When we say midpoint, pinakagitna yan. So, ibig sabihin, etong dalawang segments na to ay congruent segments. So, yun ang pwede mong ilagay na next statement mo. AR is congruent to CR. And that is by definition of midpoint. Now, since we have here a line connecting your point B up to your midpoint, so we can say, since nag-share sila, we form two triangles from this line. So, may nabuo tayong dalawang triangles dahil dito sa line na to. So, ibig sabihin, nag-share sila ng common side. Okay? So, we can say that BR is congruent to BR. Okay? So, but before that, let's have first AB is congruent to CB. That is given. Okay? So, given yan. Nilagay natin doon. So, ayan. And then, BR is congruent to BR. Okay, so we have reflexive property of congruent. So itong BR natin, since nag-share nga sila ng common side, ibig sabihin, BR is congruent to BR and that is reflexive property of congruence. Now, from the given statements and the reasons, minark natin yung ating dalawang triangles. So, as you can see, we have 3 sides of the triangle is congruent to another 3 sides of another triangle. So, we can say that triangle BAR. So, BAR is congruent to triangle BCR. So, ano kayang reason? So, since meron tayong 3 sides na congruent sa kanila, ibig sabihin that is by SSS congruence postulate. Now, so na-prove na natin na yung dalawang triangles are congruent. So, di ba kapag na-prove natin o kaya naipakita natin na yung dalawang triangles natin ay congruent, ibig sabihin all of their corresponding parts are congruent. Tama? So, yun ang tatandaan. Once na ma-prove mo na yung dalawang triangles mo ay congruent by any postulate or theorem, okay, na-prove mo na siya by SSS, ASA, lahat ng yon pwede mong gamitin, automatic, their corresponding parts are also congruent. So, ibig sabihin, angle A is congruent to angle C and that is by CPC-TC. Okay? So, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So, na-prove natin na kapag given yung dalawang sides na congruent, then the angles opposite them are also congruent. Let's have the next theorem. Theorem 6-2. So, if two angles of a triangle are congruent, then the side opposite, those angles are also congruent. So, ito naman yung converse nung theorem natin kanina. Baliktad naman. So, dito naman daw, kapag given yung two angles na congruent, then, ito daw, yung opposite side nila are also congruent. So, let's do the proof. So, ang given natin, angle P is congruent to angle N, and then we will prove that PL is congruent to NL. So, kailangan ma-prove natin to. Let's start. So, ang first statement natin, of course, angle P is congruent to angle N, that is given. Now, we will also draw the bisector of angle L, and A be a point of PN, so ito yung PN, where the bisector intersects PN. So, pag sinabi kasi nating bisector, hinahati niya. Ano ang hinati? Angle L. So, ibig sabihin, angle bisector to, kasi angle yung hinati. Pag ang segment ang hinati, ibig sabihin, ano yon? Perpendicular bisector naman yon. So, since angle ang hinahati niya, kasi angle ito, so, angle bisector po ito. So, ibig sabihin, nag-draw siya ng line, at hinati niya raw po itong dalawang angle. Okay? So, we have 2 points determine a line. So, nag-form tayo, 2 points determine a line where A is the point of segment PN. So, ito po ang reason natin dyan. Now, from here, since hinati niya nga to dahil bisector po itong LA mo, so, we can say, pwede yan ang gamitin mong third statement mo, na that angle PLA is congruent to angle NLA. Kasi bisector siya ni angle L. So, that is definition of angle bisector. Since bisector, hinati siya, so yun ang gagamitin mong reason. Okay? Next. So, we have angle P is congruent to angle N. So, we have given. Ayun po siya, given siya. Now, from here, since meron tayo ditong common side ng dalawang triangles natin, so ibig sabihin, LA is congruent to segment LA, and that is by reflexive property of congruence. Now, from the given set of congruent parts, we have angle, and side. So, triangle PLA is congruent to angle NLA, and that is by AAS congruence theorem. So, ngayon, na-prove na natin na yung dalawang triangles are congruent. So, once na ma-prove mo na kasi na yung dalawang triangles are congruent, ibig sabihin all of their corresponding parts are congruent. Matik na yan. So, ibig sabihin ito, congruent siya dyan. Itong angle na to, congruent siya dyan. So, lahat ng parts niyan congruent na kasi na-prove na natin siya na yung dalawang triangles are congruent by AAS congruence theorem. So, once na ma-prove mo na congruent yung dalawang triangles, therefore, we can say that segment PL is congruent to segment NL by CPC-TC. So, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Kaya dun sa mga previous tutorials natin, ang ginawa muna natin, kailangan matuto muna tayo mag-prove na yung dalawang triangles congruent. Kasi in this lesson, at sa mga susunod na proving statements, pag na-prove mo na yung dalawang triangles ay congruent, madali na. Okay? Kaya yung mga previous lessons natin, kailangan ma-prove muna na yung dalawang triangles congruent. Okay, let's have this theorem, 6-3. An equilateral triangle is also equiangular. Ito po yung sinasabi ko kanina na at least 2 sides. So, kapag at least 2 sides, therefore, it can be 3. And that makes it an equilateral triangle, which is a special case of isosceles triangle. So, we have this. So, pag sinabi kasi natin equilateral, all sides are congruent. Okay? So, given triangle JOY with JO is congruent to segment OY, which is also congruent to segment JY. So, we will prove that these 3 angles opposite to these 3 congruent sides are also congruent. So, kailangan ma-prove natin na itong tatlong angles na to are also congruent kasi congruent yung mga opposite sides nila. So, let's have the proof. So, our statement, so we have segment OY is congruent to segment JY. So this is segment OY is congruent to segment JY that is given. Now, since si OY ay congruent kay segment JY, so ito si OY, ito yung opposite angle niya. And then si JY, ito naman yung opposite angle niya. So since congruent ito at ito, ibig sabihin itong angle na opposite niya at angle na opposite niya are also congruent. Okay? So yun ang pwede nating next statement. So angle J is congruent to angle O. So that is by Isosceles triangle theorem. So here, we are already applying the theorem, Isosceles triangle theorem, that if two sides are congruent, so congruent sila, ibig sabihin congruent din yung opposite angles nila. Okay? And then we also have segment JO is congruent to segment JY. So this is also given. Now from here, sabi ko nga kanina, your JO, this side is opposite to this angle. And then JY, this side is opposite to this angle. So ibig sabihin, kung ito ang opposite angle niya at ito ang opposite angle niya, itong dalawang sides na to ay congruent. Ibig sabihin, itong dalawang angles na opposite niya ay congruent din. So pwede mo yun gamitin. Angle O is congruent to angle Y. So lagay po natin siya by Isosceles triangle theorem. Okay, so since these two sides are congruent, so kung congruent siya kay angle Y, ibig sabihin, kung congruent tong side na to dito, ibig sabihin, itong angle niya, congruent din dito. So now, I have here, angle J is congruent to angle O, and then angle O is congruent to angle Y. Since these two angles are both congruent to angle O, therefore by transitivity, angle J is congruent to angle O, which is also congruent to angle Y, and that is by transitivity. Why? Kasi pareho silang congruent kay angle O. Ibig sabihin, congruent din si angle J and angle Y. That's why these three angles are congruent. So we have proved that an equilateral triangle is also equiangular. So we have proved that this triangle is also equiangular. So ganun din po. An equiangular triangle is also equilateral. Let's try. So given triangle CAR is isosceles, so I have here CD is congruent to RD. Let's have the proof. So first statement, so you have CD is congruent to RD. So lagyan natin ng markings that is given. So your segment CD is congruent to RD, that is given. So lagyan mo kagad ng mark para makita mo kagad kung meron na bang 3 parts na congruent dyan. Kasi kung meron na, once na ma-prove mo na these two triangles are congruent, madali na. Okay? So we have here, since congruent po sila, ayan. So we now have CA is congruent to RA. So segment CA is congruent to RA. Okay? Why? Okay, lagyan natin ng markings. So why? Bakit ko nasabi that these two sides are congruent? Why? Kasi based dito sa given, isosceles siya. Okay? So pag sinabi isosceles, two sides are congruent. Okay? So that is definition of isosceles triangle. Now, we have angle C is congruent to angle R. Why? Kasi po dito, sabi sa isosceles triangle theorem, kapag congruent tong dalawang sides na to, yung angle na opposite sa kanila ay congruent din. So, etong angle na to, si angle C, is congruent to angle R. So, that is by isosceles triangle theorem, yung diniscuss natin kanina. Next, we have proved that these two triangles are congruent. Why? So, ito yung first triangle mo, ito yung second triangle. So, as you can see, meron tayong side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. So, na-prove natin na itong dalawang triangles are congruent by SAS congruence postulate. So, therefore, kung congruent na itong triangle na to, we can say that all of their corresponding parts are congruent. So, Therefore, si angle CAD at si angle RAD, so itong dalawang angle na to, are also congruent by CPC-DC. Okay, so once kasi na ma-prove mo na yung dalawang triangles na congruent sila, therefore all of these corresponding parts are congruent. So kung ano po yung nandito, ibig sabihin congruent na yan. Kasi na-prove mo na congruent yung dalawang triangles mo. Let's have another. So, fill in the blank with the correct word or phrase to complete each statement. I'm giving you 30 seconds to answer. So, let's answer. We have number 1, the angles opposite the congruent sides of an isosceles triangle are congruent. If blank of a triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite them are also congruent. So, ito po ay if two angles. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. An equilateral triangle is also an equiangular. And the converse, an equiangular triangle is also an equilateral triangle. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell para updated kayo for more video tutorials. This is your guide in learning your math lessons, your Wow Math channel.